Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today as we talk about the unpredictable economic times and getting prepared for your talent engagement strategies. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. Please make sure that your lines are on mute. You can use the WebEx QA feature to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and time permitting, we will respond at the end. Please be sure to complete our post-webinar survey. We always love to hear your feedback. And as always, this webinar will be recorded and sent out along with a copy of this presentation. Joining us today is Teresa Creech, CEO at TalentWave, and Doug Leeby, CEO of Beeline. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. So I'll kick us off. My name is Teresa. Thanks again for joining us. I've been with TalentWave for the last 4 years, but have spent more than 20, but we'll go without specifying years in the overall staffing and MSP space. Thanks, Doug, for joining me. Would you like to give a quick intro?
Oh, thanks. Just great to be with you. I've been with Beeline for just going on my 19th year. So like Teresa, been in the industry about 2 decades, and excited to be with you guys today.
Great. So let's spend a minute here on the agenda that we have for the upcoming hour. We're going to start with some broader workforce trends. I think they really do a nice job of setting foundation for the rest of our discussion. Layer in a little bit of information as it relates to economic uncertainty and in particular how that intersects with the workforce. We'll then move toward providing you a set of, let's call them considerations and some recommendations around how to work in this backdrop and drive operating flexibility, improvement to your overall workforce technology strategy, and a more flexible model. And we'll wrap up with some hopefully practical tips you can take away. Throughout the discussion, we do have a couple of audience polls, and as Taylor mentioned, if we have some time at the end, we'll take your questions. That said, I think we can jump in. So we have been talking about the evolution of work for a number of years, and I would say that probably a steady discussion for the last 10 years. But from my vantage point at least, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Doug, it feels like the velocity of that change has really increased. In particular, let's call it in the last 3 years or so. For me, I would translate that as a direct impact of let's call it technology advancement in combination with workforce trends and workforce preferences. But that speed of change seems to have really accelerated. I normally don't go kind of tile to tile when we're in a discussion like this, but some of these stats are really worth digging into for a moment. So bear with me for a second on a couple of these. On the upper left, nearly 80% of executives agree that work is going to be more based on projects than roles. We've seen a lot of increase in the last few years, and probably many of you with programs have as well, increases in things like SOW usage, small vendor usage, the willingness to engage sub-vendors to do work that has a little bit more finite nature than kind of traditional on-demand workers. So that increase is pretty pointed. Layer in that backdrop that the gig economy just continues to explode. $864 billion was the latest estimate from SIA, with, in a broader sense, 179% increase in overall contingent workers over the next 10 years. So just mammoth movement around how we engage workers differently and in a non-traditional FTE manner. Now down a little bit to the worker side of this, 65% of kids entering grade school will have jobs that don't even exist now. Both of my kids are in college right now. I can tell you they've already mentioned on a number of occasions, jobs that they're interested in that I've never even heard of. And so although that's interesting about the number of kids that are entering school at a young age, I think that's even more pointed around the fact that there are career paths that didn't exist even a couple years ago. The concept of virtual work and shared workspaces, everyone knows, has been on the rise and continues to be. And this last one, which I find really interesting but hear frequently from our customers, is this rise in the need for and the focus on social and emotional skills. So there was a time when you looked in particular at STEM-skilled workers, and as long as all the hard skills lined up, that checked the boxes and I might proceed with that worker. But what we've seen is that this concept around making sure that the emotional and social components of those roles line up appropriately, along with a rise in focus on company culture, is really becoming more and more important. Doug, anything you'd like to add here?
Not a lot. I guess, you struck a chord with me. I was in Australia last week having a discussion about similar trends, and you're right. I see two things happening in a major way, really in the last decade. I mean, we all can appreciate the changes in technology. Sharing with the audience, when you think back, I think some of the big brand names in technology like Google are 22 years old, but then you had applicant tracking systems 20 years ago and the Beelines of the world. But when you think of the Airbnbs and the Waze and even LinkedIn, they're actually only about a decade old. So I think that's important to keep in context, because when you reference the massive changes we're seeing in technology, it makes sense. And this notion of exponential growth combined with combinatorial solutions, meaning when you, for example, think about Waze, they can take GPS, they can use transponders to go to your phone, so they're combining different technologies to offer better solutions to the marketplace, and we're in the same boat. And then I just agree with you 100% in terms of, like, the war for talent is probably a bit cliched and misused, however, or overused, but we're seeing it a lot, and it's forcing us, Teresa, in your organization, mine, to think about different ways of servicing the clients, and we're seeing a lot of traction in the areas you're addressing. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in a moment, but I just wanted to give a little bit more color from a technology perspective. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, Taylor, you can advance the slide if you don't mind. One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking to folks in the marketplace about is the concept of the independent workforce, and that takes on a lot of flavors. It could be independent contractors, it could be traditional gig economy workers, it could be workers you're sourcing from talent cloud providers or FMS, pick your label. There's a ton of that, and the message that we try and get across is, although that might seem a bit overwhelming because there's so much of it and there's kind of no new normal yet in terms of how to interact with them, the choice to ignore it is one that I think puts companies in a lack of a competitive position, because other companies aren't ignoring that. And so as you compete for talent, making sure you understand the driving forces of all of these pieces is an important part of your overall strategy. So if you just look at a couple of the stats here, up to 57 million in the gig economy in 2017-18, that's a pretty big number. More than 1 in 3 people in America performing freelance work in 2018. Now, that doesn't mean that that's their sole career or the only thing they do, but finding ways to be a part of this movement is something that is becoming a predominance in the workforce. The last one I'll highlight here is the one in the bottom center. 51% of people who are making a career out of freelancers say they'd never go back to a normal job. And once that tops the scales as to more than half of us, that's just something we can no longer ignore. So you have to then start to think about what kinds of ways do I work these strategies into my company's strategy that makes sense. Taylor, you can move forward. Just to kick us off and make this a little bit more interactive, we do have our first audience poll. Very simple question. Has your organization pivoted to take advantage of the gig workforce? You have 36 seconds to do this. Just give us a quick answer, and I think we'll share these out in terms of results. Five more seconds. Great. Perfect. Taylor, do we see the polling real time, or will we see it at the end?
We can see it real time. It's just taking a few more seconds to collect.
Fantastic.
There we go.
Okay. So interesting. This isn't that far off of what I would have expected to see. The folks that we tend to interact with, let's call it over the last 12 to 18 months, are almost all in the somewhat category. One thing that we have also found in terms of once we dig in a little deeper to helping customers assess what's really going on is that there is often a lot more of this happening inside companies without folks necessarily knowing that that's happening. So we could spend a few minutes on that as we work through the rest of our chat here. You can move us forward, Taylor. So I find this slide gives me a little bit of a chuckle, and this is the place we all live right at the moment, which is what is going to happen in the economy. There's really no answer to that we can all get behind. So there's 100 stories every day at minimum, arguably more. And they come from all over the place. And whether you're reading what the CBO puts out or you're listening to Washington or plugging into various media sources, the predictions are a bit all over the place. But the reality is we know at some point we've got some macroeconomic shift, and the question we all have is when and how long and how deep, right? So that essentially puts us in a place, I'm going to call it storm watch, just because this week I don't know if all of you watched the news this morning, I'm sure most of you did, but the bulk of the country is under some weird storm watch this week. And for those of us that are flying around in it, that leads us to be on watch. But I think the way we're looking at the economy is a little bit similar. We're not in warning mode yet, but we're definitely in watch mode. And so the question you have to ask yourself is what do I do with that? When I think about that and how to tackle it, just for TalentWave, inside TalentWave, the most prudent stance is what can we do to be prepared for that? And that leads us really to the shift in our conversation today is how do you start to think about being prepared? You can move ahead. And obviously we're not going to tackle all the ways that you can be prepared, and nor am I the expert on all the ways you can be prepared, but we have done a lot of work on how any sort of macroeconomic shift impacts your workforce. And so let's just spend a couple minutes talking about those things. I'm not going to necessarily go in order of the slide, but I'll hit the major points. And I'm going to start with the first point being, for most companies, the biggest element of your fixed cost is wrapped up in your people cost. And so anytime there's any major macroeconomic movement, that people cost gets affected, whether it's hiring freeze or a reduction in force or a movement of work toward outsourcing, or the myriad of ways that companies look at to impact their overall workforce cost. That usually is stop number one when we're either heading toward or are experiencing any sort of pressured economic time. Now, in that backdrop, you've also got the fact that, as we talked about before, the gig economy is rising, and finding the top talent in the marketplace is getting tougher and tougher. I think this sets the stage for how we start to help you prep for kind of what's next. You can move forward, Taylor. So obviously, whenever we can, it's best if we're peeking around a corner, and it's best if we can get out in front of whatever's next. And I find that most of these things are prudent and thoughtful activities regardless of how much more runway we have before we see any sort of economic shift. The place I'd like to focus for today is how to really optimize the balance between fixed and variable people cost. So for a lot of companies, every company has fixed and variable people cost, and some of those always have to be fixed or variable. But not always do companies take a very thoughtful approach on how to look at the marriage between the work that needs to get done and the worker doing that work. The trend that I think is important for this discussion is how to evaluate work product or work output and determine what can appropriately be boxed into a project or a gig or something that I can send to a variable category. Therefore, I can flex up or down as I need to based on my financial performance. Now, if you think about, and Doug, I'll ask for your comments on this too, if you think about growth in things like SOW, which is traditionally project-based work, that has been on the rise for many, many years. But the challenge that I have for a lot of companies is, the challenge question I should say, is do you send that work out to SOWs or projects based on a strategic way to look at that, or did that just happen in some sort of organic and very honestly sometimes in an accidental way? And so this shift we're talking about means how do I look at it and put a thoughtful approach around evaluating that work. Doug, I'd love your thoughts on how you're seeing your customers approach project work versus more traditional kinds of engagements.
Well, thanks, Teresa. I think the reality is the customers are doing exactly what you're talking about, and while there's this great opportunity in front of us, few are actually exploiting it. So what you're talking about we refer to as workforce optimization. I think you and I have chatted about this on another webinar. I'm not fully bought in at this stage in time of total talent management. We can talk about total workforce acquisition, total workforce analytics, but really what that should guide towards is this notion that I can strategically look at my workforce proactively and use a little different word, output, but I same approach, look at outcomes versus, I think we're moving from an environment where we hire for positions and we move more towards hiring based on outcomes. And so I think traditionally we've looked at the world like, well, if it's core, it's full-time, and if it's not core, it's not full-time. I don't think that's a stage approach. I think let's think more in terms of outcomes and demand supply. So for example, at Beeline, we're doing a lot of work around AI, and there's a great need for data scientists. That would absolutely be considered core to us. Having said that, these guys and ladies out there with this expertise are A, hard to find, and B, very, very expensive. So while I determine that that's core, I'm not necessarily hiring these people full-time. I'm engaging with them in a more flexible approach like you're articulating. So I see some major changes that we're able to exploit now through solutions that TalentWave produces as well as Beeline.
Great, thanks. Let's take one step deeper with a little bit more practicality, let's call it, to this approach, because I think it's fairly easy for most of us to get there philosophically and conceptually, and we can read enough data to believe the stories that we're hearing and a lot of the points that we've just articulated here. So getting there mentally is not a huge leap. The huge leap comes with, okay, and what the heck do I do with that? And so this next little section for us is really going to dive into what are some thoughts and considerations on how to drive operational flexibility, variability, optimization, to Doug's point. So let's start with some simple ones. Obviously, the list here is not all-inclusive. There are many more, and some are more apropos to certain companies and more specifically certain roles. The data scientist example is a great one than others. So you have to think about it. This is not a every one of these fits every company in every spot. It's very specific to certain spots. So sometimes companies need a little help just deciding where these strategies fit. So partnering with staffing firms, of course, most of you probably do that and have done that for years, but maybe taking that a level deeper to say, why do I send this to a staffing firm versus make this an FTE or some other form of engagement? There are also lots of specialty staffing firms that have cropped up, in particular for very hard to find skills, and making sure that you have an attraction model for those specialists is really important. Another huge one, which is very much a part of what we're doing on a daily basis, is the concept called direct sourcing. Some of you call it self-sourcing, but this is a concept whereby your provider or providers work directly with your recruiters to really exploit the strength of your employer brand, pull folks in, and even if you want to send them to a payroll provider or a staffing provider or someone other than that, you've still often saved a fair good chunk of money not paying for a separate sourcing engine. But what it also does is really start to build out the beginnings of your internal talent pool, another thing which obviously both Doug and I are very passionate about and is a big part of both of our strategies. That talent pool then becomes a stop along your sourcing path for you to re-engage folks that you know work well with your culture, work well in your environment, know your business, and that leads to all kinds of things besides just cost savings in that equation. You've got reduced time to fill, higher predictability of quality, all kinds of fringe benefits attached to that particular piece there. The fourth one becomes a little bit more complex, but is absolutely doable, and I'm going to caveat that in a moment, but it's engaging the concept of external providers that are not necessarily traditional staffing providers, but come from the FMS world and the talent cloud world. Now, this can seem like a daunting thing for companies because they think, okay, I got my Wild West under control years ago when I deployed VMS and MSP, and now if I go open myself to the whatever latest number is 450 or so FMS providers, what does that do? Does that just all of a sudden make this programmatic approach uncontrolled again? And I would argue that if you look at it in that all or nothing kind of way, it does seem a bit daunting. But just like my earlier comment, there are places where this makes a lot of sense. And often the FMS providers and cloud providers have specialties, and those specialties line up to specific roles in your company or specific kinds of projects. That's where you want to go engage with them. And very often the collaboration between the combination of a Beeline, an MSP, a TalentWave, and the cloud providers can be a very strong argument toward much broader access to talent. So in that one, I'd say enter carefully, but by all means do enter. Next, manage new hires through a payrolling provider. Of course, that's something we feel strongly about as a large payrolling provider, but there are a lot of companies who engage companies like ours to manage the probationary hiring period. So if your probationary period is 90 days, put them through an external provider, that means any of that liability associated with the worker not working out is now on the payrolling provider, not on you. And again, if you're looking at a strategy toward uncertain economic times, this is one way to mitigate that hiring period risk. Don't be afraid of independent contractors is number 6. And of course, I'm an evangelist for independent contractors, so I'm gonna always be big supporters of ICs. They're good for our economy. They're often specialists that bring highly competitive skills to your environment, and there's absolutely a way to do that safely. And lastly, really restructure the overall model so that you understand and have a thoughtful approach to what can be project-based versus what maybe needs to be a longer or a more uncertain engagement. So those are things that absolutely can be figured out. Again, it's never going to be perfect, but if you've got strong experts around you and people you can talk to about these things, they're very easy to deploy in bite-sized chunks and where they matter in terms of relevance. That said, I think I'm handing the baton to you, Doug, for a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa. And great job on that last slide. We're totally aligned. The one thing I would add, though, is I agree 100% that you have to look at FMS and cloud providers, but one must do it safely as well. And as I articulated a little bit earlier, the advances in technology have afforded us the ability to give our clients the best of both worlds. So in other words, what we've been telling the market, meaning these cloud providers, is you're going to have a hard time getting into the enterprise because you're not going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on SOC 1, 2, 3, SA16, all the stuff that we do to ensure that data is safe and secure. So they should go through the Beeline public talent ecosystem. And that ensures auditability, security, same user experience, SLAs, and all the data is in one place. So I think there's this massive confusion in the marketplace because they're hearing about all these providers in the gig economy. But they're like, well, I already have a VMS, or I have an FMS, or I don't need that. They just don't know. And I guess what I would articulate is that you want to ensure that your VMS is the truth of the record of truth, and that everything else pipes into that, so that for the reasons I mentioned beforehand. So as I get going into my area here, it is about agility. And we've certainly supported a transactional model over the last few decades. But as Teresa said, people is so vital and so important, such an integral part of our spend. It's time for us, I believe, to start looking at this more strategically from a workforce optimization perspective, as I said, but also really from a people perspective. And so what I mean by that is, we're talking about people. We're not talking about pencils. And while 70% of my clients are in the procurement world, many of us are having discussions with, okay, certainly you've got to do procurement 101 and worry about contracts and SLAs, but the enterprise and the C-suite's looking for a lot more of a partnership between HR and procurement. And so, in our opinion, people are not a spend category. We have to expand talent sources. If you think about what we've done in the past, we brought all these great MSPs and VMS solutions to you 20 years ago, and that was great. We came off of Y2K, we had a bit of a downturn in the economy, and we had to employ procurement 101 and start getting costs in line. But it's a bit counterintuitive because the way we did that was supplier funded, meaning we need to have skin in the game for suppliers. So we reduced, let's say you have 30 or 40 suppliers, we took that down to 10 for obvious reasons. Well, by eliminating 20 or 30 of these suppliers, you actually limited some of your access to talent as well. Now we find ourselves at this opportune time where you have the best of both worlds. You can actually go leverage alternative modes of sources of talent, the means that Teresa just described, and you can still have your procurement 101 practices in place. But again, we need to look at this as a people issue and expanding our options with talent, not limiting them. Certainly, humans are very important with the AI. Everybody's talking about their algorithms and their proprietary algorithms and their AI, and that's great. We need to have that. But what I'll tell you is from a Beeline perspective, we think it's very important that it's more like augmented intelligence versus artificial. We're garnering some really fascinating insights out of the data in Beeline, but we still believe people need to be there to make the decisions based on the data versus the data just always making decisions. Certainly there's some transactional workflows that we can automate through AI, but in the end, we always have to remember that it's always about people. I already referenced the data, and this gets me on my soapbox a bit in terms of, Teresa, earlier you were asking about the usage of SOW. Well, certainly all companies are doing it, but at Beeline, only 30% of my clients are actually utilizing the SOW solution, which is myriad reasons. There's a lot of constituents you have to sell into the process. I understand that. But I find it a bit ironic that everybody's talking about total talent management when we haven't even done a good job totally managing the external talent. So what I talk about mostly is just get all of your people in the system. If you're not using Beeline, you're using someone else, that's fine. But get them in the system, because the data is king. And with the advances in technology, we're able now, as I said earlier, to employ some of the really cool stuff coming out of machine learning to give you better insights that make you able to make better decisions. And then again, this just basically feeds into this notion of optimization. I would say first you have to optimize your non-employee base, and then once you do that, we can start to zoom out a bit and look at how that marries up against the employee versus the non-employee base. Next slide, Taylor. So again, some market influences that are affecting us today. Talent supply dynamics are driving adoption, as we've discussed, but I mean, we're getting a lot of traction on this right now, but it's interesting to me behaviorally, there's still a fair amount of trepidation around this. And I can tell you that this has become probably the industry's greatest no-brainer. I mean, we've got, for example, tight integrations with TalentWave, got tight integrations with TalentNet. You just got to make sure you get a curator in the process if you're going to make this a strategy where you're looking for 25% or more of your fills to come out of that. But the solutions are out there today, and obviously there's folks out there who are garnering a lot of success from them. I already talked about artificial intelligence, and that's creating all sorts of new opportunities for our clients. And the other area that we're focusing in on is this notion that, you know, I keep asking the question, is your technology or your VMS narcissistic? In other words, is your solution expecting you to log into them and have to go through all their workflows, or are they looking at the world a bit differently from a consumer's perspective and more of a concierge approach that says, gosh, in this case, Teresa, I noticed that through the data, every year this time you hire 4 project managers, and I understand the skill attributes the TalentWave looks for. I also understand some cultural and emotional intelligence attributes that you specifically look for. Not only am I going to ask if you want to click the button to go create a requisition, but more importantly, here are 3 or 4 candidates who I think would be great matches, bringing them to you where you are. That doesn't necessarily have to be in the VMS. That could be on your iPhone. It could be, in Slack or Teams or Skype. And this is the way that the technology is going. It's very exciting. And as I said, I was just in Australia last week where they were lamenting the fact that 70% of the people in the room don't even have a VMS, which is kind of interesting to me. And they talked about utilizing Excel. And so, well, guys, you know, it can actually be an advantage if you think about where most of the cities in America and in other quote-unquote first world nations arose is always around the rivers, right, for commerce reasons. Yet take a page out of the lesson book of Africa and you see a lot of the cities starting to migrate not towards the waterways but towards cell towers. So they were actually in many areas able to completely skip over the industrial revolution and get right into the second revolution. And so similar for our friends in Australia, maybe they don't necessarily have to go through everything that we've gone through here in the last 2 decades. They can just immediately jump on the usage of talent pools and artificial intelligence and this concierge type service that I'm describing. Okay, T? So a lot of people are talking about the Agile Workforce. And as I said, part of my frustration, frankly, with our industry at large is that, and Teresa, you mentioned as well, like these solutions are there. Again, there's just some sort of obstacles or trepidation to go there. But we've actually seen tremendous growth in technology and in some of these solutions and the usage of the gig economy in the last several years, but so few people are actually formalizing a strategy around it. So I already talked about human-centric AI, and clearly we can accelerate workflows and we can assist with talent identification. We can help write better job descriptions. There's all sorts of things that are coming out from that which will make the process better. Direct sourcing to access private and public talent pools, Teresa already talked about. I'll just elaborate a little bit. We look at the world 2 ways in terms of direct sourcing. You could create a ring-fenced private talent pool, which is a great and very effective approach that Teresa's already talked about. And you could also leverage what we'll call public talent pools. So your requisition could go to your preferred supply list. It could also go maybe prior to that to your private talent pool, or they can all go simultaneously, whatever you want. But there's another option that's going out to the public talent pools, in which we've partnered with these providers like Teresa already talked about, from FMSs to other online staffing providers. But in the end, it's always going to be the data, as I said earlier, and we're learning and discerning so much from the data that, you know, it's enabling us to help our clients make better decisions and get further down the path of workforce optimization. Next slide, please. So what do we need to do to truly tackle workforce optimization? As Teresa said, it's great to talk up at 30,000 feet, but there are specific things that we can do to make it more adaptable. And you know, we really need to start adopting some of these practices, in my opinion. So from a technology and solutions perspective, Teresa's here, I'm here, we're ready, but where are you in the organization? And I totally agree, Teresa, with your comments around the economic downturn. I don't know when it's happening, but we do know it's going to happen. Hopefully it won't be severe, but I highly encourage people to create talent pools prior to that, not just for the cost savings opportunities, but again, there's war on talent and the difficulty in getting talent. You know, if you're still able to produce the outcomes that your organization is looking for quicker and in a less expensive manner, why wouldn't you do that, and why wouldn't you prepare for that prior to? Because I'll tell you, when the economic downturn comes, Teresa and I are going to be getting a lot of knocks on the door to stand these programs up, and we'll happily do so, but I would just recommend getting ahead of that game. And for us, it's not just ICs, it's anybody who's a non-full-time person can go into these talent pools. Of course, this is where my friend Teresa comes into play. Once you've gotten everybody into the VMS, you have to risk-proof it. So you need somebody to ensure that they are properly classified. And so are they really SOW, or are they more staff augmentation? And ensuring that they're properly classified is the next step. The other area I talk about is capturing metrics on the people themselves. And I always hear co-employment, everybody's afraid to put a rating with a person. They're happy to do it with the staffing provider, but that's only interesting at best to me. I mean, we know which providers are doing a good job. But in order for us to get the data and run it through the machine, as I say, so I can do a better job with this concierge approach for you, it's really important that you guys ascribe quality to the person. And again, we can be very circumspect, and we don't have to worry about co-employment if we're doing things like a 1 to 5 scale, or even something as sophomoric as a thumbs up, thumbs down. But something that informs whether or not that was a good fit for your organization will help us do a better job matching and placing in the future. We've already talked about private talent pools. There's no question in my mind this is the next wave. It is the future. We're ready. I know Teresa is, and we're getting a heavy amount of adoption on this. I will just throw out a caveat, though. It's not as easy as it sounds. Certainly setting up the technology is very simple. What I would say is that you have to have somebody own this. And so we're seeing the rise of curators, whether that comes from people like TalentWave or independent people out there saying, I don't want to be an MSP, but I actually want to help operate in an RPO manner. In other words, I won't own the candidates, you will, but I will go source and find them and populate your private talent pools with them. And then once that's in there, Beeline can do its work, and we can employ our machine learning to then start to look at predictive modeling, and when you have desired outcomes, we can look at potentials of different models. So for example, would I be better off with 3 full-time people and 6 contractors and 2 consultants, or am I better off also? Like, we don't know until we get the data and start running it through. But organizations who are earlier adopters and working with us in this direction are going to be the beneficiaries of this great solution set that the Teresas of the world are coming out with, and the Beelines of the world, so that you can truly move more towards a workforce optimization model and have your enterprise in good standing, not just now, but also when things get a little bit tough.
Doug, one quick add on your comments around risk-proofing your workforce. I think you absolutely captured the places that are really critical, like worker classification, like co-employment, but there's a whole other set of things too that I'd add to that have to do with things like protecting intellectual property, making sure that the contract itself is buttoned down well. And so as folks start to think about their practical plan, that risk-proofing piece often goes a few layers deeper than I think folks maybe see at the onset. So just a quick add there.
Yeah, great point. Thanks for that. Okay, next slide. I'm not sure if it's poll time or if I got another one. No, one more. I'm not going to read through this whole slide. I think I've talked enough about the workforce optimization model, but it just makes a lot of sense. Right? We already talked about the cost savings. Teresa talked about this try before you buy mentality, which I completely agree with. Certainly we want organizations to leverage their brands and to actually attract the workers who want flexibility, and a lot of them do. I also think you're going to see more specialization. So within these private talent pools, I think you'll see segmentation. And so focus, you know, where you need them and go after the specialized skill sets. We can, of course, follow the same practices we have done traditionally from a technology perspective and in a programmatic perspective, reducing liability and ensuring that your regulatory practices are in line. And I won't go off the last couple, you get it. But I think, you know, there's just a lot of compelling reasons why organizations are moving in this direction, and now it's been made easier than ever. So just highly encourage you to dip your toe into this pond. Next. All right, I'll read this out for you all because there's quite a bit of verbiage here. But the poll is, and feel free to click it as I'm reading if you're a faster reader than I am, what strategies are you using to engage talent today? And in this one, you can check multiple. So A, are you building a collaborative strategy for direct sourcing, using internal recruitment and a payroll provider? Are you engaging talent cloud providers or specialists where talent is scarce? You're probably all using staffing firms to fill your seats. Do you engage experts in your market, such as small vendors and ICs? And are you managing your project-based bench of workers, such as creative talent, for example, through a payroll provider? I'll just give you about 10 more seconds here. And I'll just throw out while you're doing that, Teresa, also around the risk. I think some folks don't really understand that, you know, when you engage with a private talent pool or a public talent pool, there is no more risk because we're still utilizing TalentWave, who indemnifies, just as we would with self-referred candidates. So a lot of people are like, but it's risky, it's not going through staffing firms. Like, no, it's the same way we're doing the self-identifieds. The system's already constructed and ready to go. All right, great.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. Yep.
Some results. All right, so again, no surprise, everybody for the most part, not everybody, but quite a few who answered are using staffing and some experts. Talent Cloud, not surprising either, very, very small percentage, and that's really why Teresa and I banded together to try to educate a little bit more on this important topic.
Hey, Doug, let me ask your opinion on this.
Sure.
If you were just to guess at a percentage of companies who actually are engaging in, let's call it public cloud providers, but just don't know it, meaning the program seat owner just doesn't know it, what would you guess that percentage is?
I think I'd be conservative at 90%.
Yeah,
right?
I do too. We've certainly seen a lot of that. There are ways, just by the way, since I brought that question up, there are ways that you can find that spend. I know one of the things that we do is something we call a health check, which essentially goes out and assesses where that kind of spend might be hiding. And then we work with Doug and team to figure out the best way to address it. But just know for the four that have, you know, as part of a formal strategy, engaging Talent Cloud, there's probably many of you that have individual managers or individual pockets of public cloud usage on a pretty regular basis. We even see this stuff come through on, you know, credit cards. It's pretty predominant in terms of what I'll call it the dabbling stage.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and we see a lot on credit cards as well. And it's interesting when I've got my customer advisory council in town, we talk about stuff like this. And I think you'd be shocked at how many people say, well, we don't use freelancers or independent contractors. And like, I know for a fact they do, right? But what they're really saying is it's not under my purview. And I think, Teresa, what you and I are articulating is it should be for a governance and a risk perspective and just an overall strategic workforce planning perspective. But it's out there. And you're at risk, you know, if you're doing a bunch of one-offs that aren't conforming to the governance model you put in place, and that can easily be remedied by running it through these solutions we're discussing today.
Yeah, that's right. I think we just have one more, Taylor, to wrap up. Doug, you want to drive or you want me to drive?
Yeah, go ahead and drive. Thanks.
So I think we've covered these topics in various flavors, but let's just do a quick summary of them. The first one, I think the most important thing to remember about this is, regardless of whether this has become a formal part of your strategy or not, there is a lot of change in the workforce environment, and that's stemming from the rise of the gig worker and the fact that workers want to work that way. It's stemming from the fact that especially, let's just talk about the U.S. market for a moment, we are not churning out enough of the types of skills we need to churn out in the folks that are entering the workforce. We've got other folks either exiting the workforce or exiting traditional engagements and wanting to re-engage as an expert of some fashion, forming small companies to do project expertise. So regardless of whether or not you've decided to make this part of your strategy, it is happening around you and others are. And so my encouragement would be, if you are experiencing any of those, let's call it pockets of challenge, these alternative solutions and options are not far-fetched anymore. They're real and they're on the ground, and there are ways for you to experiment with them safely and visibly to define what fits with your needs. The next one, obviously all of this needs to be made possible by the foundational components of the technology. Absent that, you would be opening yourself up to lack of visibility, increased risk, maybe an impossibility to make this strategic. So the underpinning of the technology is to me the must-have in this whole list. Understanding your current workforce, you'd be surprised at how few companies let's call it all the way, understand their workforce. Most understand a good chunk of the obvious spots, but there's hidden stuff there. So making sure that that becomes something you spend some time on. And by the way, the more you drive toward your VMS solution, the more this just goes away, because now you can see what you've got and decide how you're going to address it. Don't be afraid of ICs. That's a myth that really needs to go away. There are folks that can help you through that, can contractually protect you there. So that needs to be something that becomes less of a fear-based thing and more of an opportunistic avenue for talent. Evaluate the opportunities to transition W-2 workers, and I'll give you examples here. So we work with a number of folks let's call it the broader consulting space, where we may take on the employer of record for their bench of experts, and that allows them to engage and disengage as those projects ramp up or down. We do the same for pockets of folks like creatives. Those are very often ICs, not W-2s, where they may be engaged to do individual marketing activities. Maybe it's a film shoot, or maybe it's some sort of creative project, but they don't stay on the same project over and over again. So again, they become part of this outsourced structure of a talent pool. The sixth one here, I think, is highly critical, but becomes even more critical as you build out your preparation strategy for whatever's coming next, and it's making sure that your brand is rock solid and that the attraction pieces of your plan are going to hold up, because again, once the talent market gets even tighter and we've got economic challenges, that brand is what draws people in. And it does matter, by the way, even on the contingent side, and I think very often customers neglect to realize that those attraction components matter regardless of the worker engagement. And then last, you know, Doug and I are big proponents of being helpful to folks as experts in the space, but a lot of these things do require translation, and I would encourage you not to be afraid of having those discussions. Most of us are very open to helping you chat through different ideas and considerations, and you don't have to open a big formal sales process to get that sort of advice. And at this point, given the number of changes we've seen in the market, learning how we're each skinning our knees and learning how we're each finding successes is a really good way to help you refine your overall strategy. Anything to add there, Doug, before we open it up for questions?
No, great close, thanks. We're certainly open to questions.
Okay, thank you so much for spending the time with us, and I think Taylor will give us any questions that you've submitted during the course of this discussion.
So our first question is, there are so many FMS providers. How would I go about deciding which ones to work with?
Doug,
you want to jump in, or would you like me to start?
Why don't I jump in, and then if you don't mind, you can correct me. I think what I would say is there are a lot.
I didn't dream of it, by the way.
Yeah, right. Maybe just not on the phone. But at any rate, I think there certainly are a lot of FMS providers. But again, you have to start with the desired outcome. What are you trying to achieve specifically? And you have to be a bit weary of, I mean, just appreciate that a lot of these providers are startups, and they're great people, and they're ambitious. And sometimes they can get ahead of their skis a little bit, right? So, of course we can fill those types of positions. So what I would be doing, so for example, there's a company actually out of Harvard Innovation Labs, really interesting. All he's doing is focusing in, from an FMS perspective, on data scientists and AI experts. I think that's really, really smart. He's not trying to be all things to all people, but he's built a really strong marketplace for that type of talent. You know, years ago we bought Enforce, and they catered primarily to low-end technical workers. So I guess what I would do is say, you know, start with what am I trying to accomplish, what types of roles am I trying to get, and then vet those firms appropriately. And then, as Teresa said, ask the experts, because we're working with them as well. And again, I wouldn't necessarily just engage and say, let's open up the system. I'd say, you got to go through my VMS because the governance is already in place, and we'll try you out a bit. But I wouldn't rely 100%. I'd try a bit, and you will be met with some success, but you'll be able to tweak the model as you go as well, and maybe try some other folks. Teresa, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I almost exactly the same words, probably not as eloquently as you just put it, but almost the exact same concepts at least. There are a lot of specialists, and I think you hit on that note perfectly. So, you know, matching the need to the specialist is really critical, and then making sure that when you engage them, you've got an appropriate wrapper for all of this to land. Back to your source of truth comment before, Doug.
Great. Taylor, any other questions?
Yeah, the next one. How do you structure an RFP to include the various talent models that are available?
I'm happy to take it, or Teresa, you want to take this one, and then I'll pile on?
Yeah, I'll start and you chime in.
Sure.
Okay. It is tricky because your audience can be so varied. At least from my vantage point, I think it would be difficult to write an RFP, a single RFP, that strings together every talent option you have here, which would include everything from direct sourcing to actual RPO to staffing to MSP to FMS. It would be very hard to wrap into one document that then you're going to be able to find your decision committee reading 300 pages from 100 providers. That sounds pretty daunting to me. So I might suggest that the best path is to carve it off a bit and make sure that it's narrowed down to a more specific piece. So if you're looking for a certain kind of talent, a certain kind of roles, that would be helpful to maybe limit it that way. I think it'd be tough to do an all-in-one sort of scenario. Now, with that said, when you do any sort of of talent RFP. I think asking folks to volunteer alternative solution design models is a critical thing, because no matter who you're selecting in that model, remember, you should be selecting them for what you're going to get from them a couple years out, not what you get from them necessarily just today. And so understanding how they're approaching these alternative models is something I'd encourage.
Yeah, I agree. I think that ocean's way too deep to boil. I think, again, start with the end game, and as Teresa just articulated, what's out in the next couple of years. And so, obviously, if you're going to be sending this out to MSPs, I would ask them just for their overall approach to talent management, including total talent management, because most of them are talking about just because I'm not a huge proponent of that term doesn't mean it's not real or that they don't have a good perspective on it. And look, they're doing a nice job getting out in the market and trying to understand what all the different offerings are as well. And then you also have a host of consultants who are specialized in this in our space if you're not interested in an MSP. But again, I would feel free to pick up the phone and call me or call Teresa and say, hey, who do you know in the industry that has a pretty good handle on X? But I don't think there is just a single solution or one size that fits all. We need to very carefully figure out what it is you're after. And then, you know, you can either leave it to the MSP or your technology provider, say, here are the ones with whom we've had a lot of success. Let's try them first, and then expand as we go.
Great. Well, that was it for our questions. Thank you, everybody, again, for joining us, and thank you, Teresa and Doug, for jumping on and presenting this great content. This was recorded, and a copy of the presentation will be sent out to all attendees. Please remember to complete our post-event survey. We always really love to hear your feedback, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thanks, Doug.
Yep, bye-bye.